RadioNext.tv on the Cool Groove site. You are listening to RadioNext.tv and the Warp and Woof Radio Show. Dr. Mark Eckel, Harold H.B. Bell, in the house again. How are you, Doctor?
We're doing real well this morning.
And let me say belated happy birthday to you.
Oh, thank you. It was a great time being with you at the club the other night. Thank you ever so much for introducing me around.
You know, my joke was, Gino in his promotion said, and special appearance by Catfish and Tartar Sauce. I said I was catfish and you were tartar.
Oh, nice. I love it.
No, we've got a great program today, and if you didn't know, let them know about Warp and Woof, our tagline, and then we're going to talk about our special guest today, play a song, and come back, and we're going to get right into it. Go ahead.
We are going to talk about parenting and education, and we are going to be talking specifically in the second hour with Camille Cantwell, who has had tremendous experience not only in the parenting realm but also in educational emphasis and the political leadership side of things. So she has a very interesting insight to give us today, this afternoon.
And it's important each and every week that you understand the Comenius Institute is a great organization that bridges the gap between first-time college students leaving home for the first time and teaching them some valuable principles straight from the book of Proverbs.
There you go.
And we're going to dive into it when we come back off of this break. You are listening to the Warp and Woof Radio Show on RadioNext.tv and the Cool Groove site.
Shine, baby, shine.
And we are back. You're listening to Mark Eckel, Harold H.B. Bell, Warp and Woof Radio. If you don't know what Warp and Woof is, go to warpandwoof.org and find out how it's just a fine twining and weaving and togetherness like we should be as a community. How about
there
that?
You go. That was really good. Twining and weaving. I like it. That's good.
Any adjective like that that means the blending.
That's right.
Warping and woofing, and that's what we do each and every Wednesday morning, 10 o'clock a.m. to 12 o'clock p.m. And this is a very, very good show today. We're going to be talking to Miss Camille Cantwell in the second hour. First hour, though, as you know, we always like to dive into the book of Proverbs. And where we rest. And why Proverbs 22:6, Mark?
Oh, 22:6, man. This is one of those famous verses. Everybody in the world quotes this thing, and nobody really understands it all that well. So here it is. Train up a child in the way they should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it. Okay, that's the baseline English translation of that verse. I wish I had a nickel for every single time I heard this verse twisted the wrong way. I'd be a rich man. So I got two ideas here that I want to make sure everybody hears about 22:6. The first one is this. That phrase, the way they should go, in Hebrew should be translated the way they are bent. The way they are bent. Now that means that we recognize the person of the student, that everybody's not the same, that the conditions of our approach to people in education ought to be toward individual learners. So Proverbs 22:6 says, start a child according to their nature. The nature of children differs from person to person. My children are not the same. My grandchildren are not the same. My responsibility as an educator is to find out how best a student learns and then teach that way. So it could be hands-on. Somebody learns best with they're doing stuff with their hands. Maybe somebody's learning by experience. Maybe somebody's an auditory learner. Maybe somebody's a visual learner. Maybe somebody's a kinesthetic learner, which means that their whole body gets involved in this thing. Kind of like you bouncing and jiving over here to jazz music every Wednesday.
I can't help it.
You're a kinesthetic kind of guy.
The music fills me.
There you go.
Yeah.
Well, the second idea about 22:6 is this. There is no guarantee. And I want to emphasize this because Proverbs, the idea behind Proverbs is that these are general rules that apply across the board universally. This is generally what will occur if we do this. So I want to make a special message to all the parents. If you've done a good job, you've been kind, generous, firm, and your children have turned out in a different way, there's no blame to go around here. So understand the two ideas. We teach people according to their bent, toward their nature, and there's no guarantee necessarily that everybody's going to turn out one way.
Well, you know what's amazing about that? It is so contradictory to what you were just talking about in Proverbs 22:6 is so contradictory to our educational system.
Absolutely.
Because we do so much blanket education that we lose the identity and the individualism of students.
That's right.
So we have to rethink this thing.
Absolutely, man.
And so explain what it does and what does it mean.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's be real clear. Frankly, parenting hasn't changed since the Bible was written. Parenting isn't any harder now than it was then. So yesterday I was sitting with a pastor for 3 hours. We were having a conversation about lots of different stuff. But he said this to me. I was blown away by what he said. He said, I have little patience for young mothers today who complain about raising a couple of little ones. And then he goes on to say this. He said, my mama raised 9 of us by herself in the 60s and 70s after my dad had passed. So here's this mom raising 9 kids in 1960s, a black woman in the inner city raising 9 kids, and guess what? 7 have advanced degrees. They're all in great shape, doing great things for God. In fact, he said, and none of us smoke.
Yeah.
This was this cool thing, that he tagged on there. So when I think about this, and this is something that folks get kind of twisted about the Bible hasn't changed. And what has changed, however, is us. And so what we need to do is we need to go back to the roots. So here's one word from Proverbs we need to discuss. The word is guidance. The word guidance in Proverbs literally comes from a root which means to take, and it means to be taken by or persuaded in an argument. The object is to add to or increase what we already have. So the idea is of grasping or holding on to something, comprehending what is known in order to teach and persuade others the order of the day. So when we receive knowledge, we're focusing on perspective and acquiring a certain mindset or way of thinking. And there it is, a change in our mindset or way of thinking.
Renewing your mind.
There you go.
As Alfred Weems says, that renewing that mind. And it's amazing. I've told you this story before. My grandmother, a little African-American woman, all 5'1" of her, had a bric-and-brac store, owned her own business from the time that I was born till I can remember when she passed. And her husband was 29 years her senior, so he had a stroke and she was taking care of him. She had 8 kids, and then my mother had 2 kids early, so my mother was gone, but she replaced my mother with 2 grandkids.
Yeah.
So we had about, in a little 3-bedroom, I don't know. When I look back now, I'm amazed at the strength and the will for her to just continue on.
Absolutely.
It was a 3-bedroom house, and there was about 9 of us in this little 3-bedroom house. And,
there you go.
So parenting, as you mentioned, it's not harder. You just have to get back to some fundamentals.
There it is.
Yeah.
That's always the issue.
So what can parents learn from Proverbs, and how can the principles be applied today? We do have this mechanism out here where kids can get information too soon.
Oh, yeah.
So what do we do?
So I mentioned the idea of mindset and change the way of your thinking, so I got to throw an old movie line at you. Cool Hand Luke. You got to get your mind right. You got to get your mind right, man. So Proverbs 4:13 says, hold on to instruction. Don't let it go. Guard it well, for it's your life. So this admonition is just important today as it was in Solomon's day. One of the great Hebrew scholars of the 20th century, his name was Abraham Heschel, said this: what we need more than anything else is not textbooks, but text people. Not textbooks, but text people. So here's the issue. It's the personality of the teacher that is the text that the pupils read, the text they will never forget. The knowledge is not so much the informed mind, but the mind transformed by knowing God's truth, and the result is accuracy or proper steering of mindset onto the right course. And here's the tagline. Here's our tagline for today. There is no expiration date on God's truth. No expiration date on God's truth.
I guess on that we need to go take a break. But as we always say, nothing's wrong with our students or our children. Something's wrong with the way we're educated.
There you go.
So
absolutely.
Let's get on that. We'll be right back. You're listening to the Warp and Woof Radio Show on the Cool Groove site. RadioNext.tv. We are on the Cool Groove site. That is Mr. Eric Essex, and don't change. I'm feeling kind of good up in here this morning. Dr. Mark Eckel. And we have special guest, Camille Cantwell, in the house, and we'll be talking to her in the second hour. But in the first hour, we brought to you Proverbs 22:6, which talks about how you raise your child. And as you mentioned, every preacher in the world's using that tagline. And most don't translate it as you did. How does parenting promote a better culture, Mark? I mean, it would seem simple and easy enough, but we just don't take it as you mentioned earlier, we don't take it as serious as we need to or used to. We've lost our boundary of what a good parent is.
Yeah, exactly true. So let me just tell you this story. I was actually mowing my lawn one day, and I'm watching this dad and his son walking down the street. The father's on the cell phone. The son is literally pulling on his dad's elbow, Dad, I want to talk to you. Dad's still on the cell phone doing whatever. And so finally the kid hooks up his own headphones, his own buds, puts them in the ear, and that's it. I mean, the dividing line had happened right in front of me. And I'm yelling, of course, like nobody can hear me, but I'm yelling over my lawnmower, you're going to lose this kid if you don't do something, The son is tuned out. I got to say a bunch of things, but I got to say this first of all. There is a big, huge difference between quality time and quantity time. I do not believe in quality time. I believe in quantity time. You got to show up. You got to be there. You do not set up interviews with your kids. You have to be with them. That's huge. Here's an example of this. Just this week, one of the things that I picked up on the net was some folks who are really concerned about how smartphones are harming children's abilities to hold conversations. Here's what this says. One teacher who was dealing with a smartphone issue said, there's a limited parent-child interaction. 4-year-olds know how to swipe a phone but don't have a clue about conversation. Another primary school leader warned, we're having more and more children entering our early years stage with delayed speech and lack of school readiness. Oh my word, can it get any more direct than that? Here you have educators who are saying, these folks don't know how to converse. Here's another example of this. This is from the New York Times. 5 things teachers wish parents knew about their own kids. Here's number 4 out of 5. Your children learn and act according to what you do, not what you say. They learn according to what you do, not what you say. Now, I don't need the New York Times to tell me that, quite frankly. That was told to me every single day when I was growing up. I don't care what you are thinking about. I care what you do. Don't follow what I'm saying. Follow what I'm doing. That's a real crucial issue. So when we talk about the issue of promoting a better culture, show up. Show up. Quantity time with your kids, man. That's it.
Say there's never a time when the door shouldn't be answered when the kids come a knocking.
That's right.
So
That's right.
We
exactly.
Have to
be there.
Be there.
Yeah.
And tell us about some cultural readings that might help parenting in the 21st century.
Yeah, well, it's funny. I always tell people I got to go back to history to prove some of this stuff to folks. So I'm going to give you a historic example. I'm going to give you probably the most brilliant American ever born on these shores. His name was Jonathan Edwards. Now, Jonathan Edwards left a remarkable legacy. He was a brilliant scholar, writer, preacher, but not only through his books and sermons, but through his family. So here you go. He and his wife, Sarah, had 11 children. They passed on a godly heritage through 4 generations. Their cultural heritage was equally rich. Here it is. By 1900, over 100 years, the family's descendants included 13 college presidents, 30 judges, 65 professors, 66 physicians, 80 public officials, and 100 lawyers.
Wow.
Jonathan Edwards' family over 100 years. So if you want to shape the American character and you want to talk about long-range culture building, we got to talk about how you parent your kids. So let me give you just some quick examples of this. There are a ton of Christian mommy bloggers out there. Just go online, find your favorite Christian mommy blogger they are doing the work day in, day out, and they are making some great inroads for folks, telling them some great stuff to follow. Erica Sweeting, one of my former students from Moody, she's got one of these blogs. She's doing it. She's raising her own kids and helping others help raise theirs. But here it is. The parents who are doing the hard work of being with their children moment by moment, the stay-at-home moms, the stay-at-home dads. I think of women like my daughter Chelsea, who has 2. She runs a house, helps her husband minister in church. Look, man, this is not rocket science. This is just straightforward, be there.
And maybe that's one of the problems we have in today's economy. With parents having to work sometimes
That's
2
right.
or 3 jobs just
Yep.
to, in defense of some of these parents. I mean, because if you can't be there to maintain household, maintain real life situations, now we've got a serious chasm.
That's right.
That's making that divide of parenting versus decision making for our children is almost impossible. Tell us some movies though, Mark, that we might be able to watch to pick up on wise parenting?
Sure, absolutely. So I got a couple of old television shows for you. One back from the 1980s, 90s called The Wonder Years. Now, I know when I reach back and I talk about some of these things, I'm sure people are shaking their heads. But my wife is rewatching The Wonder Years now after all these years. Yeah, exactly. I mean, they have got some great, every single show has this wise ending to it. I highly recommend it. Everybody loves Raymond. You know, the thing I love about that show is that everybody on that show gets it. It's not an anti-man, it's not an anti-woman, it's everybody gets it. And the hilarity of it is the wisdom of it. So like, what was it, a week or two ago we were talking about cosmic comedy, how comedy comes from outside of us and the necessity of that. It's a great show. Here are some movie ideas. An Education. An Education. That's the title of the film. And it goes like this. Listen to your parents. Beware of your emotions. Your affections can be fleeting. There are 3 great lessons from the movie An Education. How much are we willing to give up to be a family? What happens when self-interest meets others' interests? And is our way the best way, or is there another way? That's the whole point behind the movie Saving Sarah Kane. It offers answers to those 3 questions. And here's one more. The Emperor's Club, one of my favorite all-time educational movies with Kevin Kline. Here is a man who holds strict standards and boundaries for education in his classroom. He helps his students grow and learn how to become who they are. But of course, one of the main characters in the show is this Proverbs 22:6 guy. There are no guarantees. He turns out to be a raunchy politician, but nonetheless, all the rest of his proteges, all of his other students have come out quite well. So you never know, but for the most part, our responsibility is to teach wise, universal principles, and the Emperor's Club is a great way to go.
Now, before we go on this break, just a question from a personal perspective.
Sure.
What do we do in control of the devices and the tools that technology has today? And we talk about it all the time, the divide between the people pretty much 45, 50 and over, fearing and lacking how to use the devices today. Young kids born into this generation, I mean, they take to it like water. How do we close that gap and make sure that we have some type of parental control?
Sure. Now, there are some great programs out there. I know that you're working on one yourself, bringing folks who are older into the tech age, into the 21st century. But I got to say that one of my biggest concerns is for the young person who needs to be limited in their time on these devices. So there needs to be time limits established. We need to shut down screen time and open up book time. So I think one of the big issues that engages us here is about boundaries and discipline. It's hard to be disciplined. It's hard to be consistent. That's really, really tough for parents, but it's really huge. So to close the gap, I'm looking at you going, you've got a program that's going to help people, it's going to help folks that are older connect. We got to help the young people slow down and then reconnect to books, listen to older folks, have conversations, learn how to talk.
And as you mentioned before, their skills in reading, writing, oral skills are being diluted.
That's right.
By using these tools. We'll be right back. You're listening to Warp and Woof Radio on the Cool Groove site. RadioNext.tv on the Cool Groove site, Warp and Woof Radio, and this is the 3rd segment of our first hour. And as we always like to say, instruction, instruction, instruction. Mark Eckel, do good, big brother.
There it is, man. There it is.
We're talking about Proverbs today, and basically the way you guide and lead your child is the way your child shall be raised.
Exactly.
And the way they will grow up. And who are some of the Christians in Indianapolis who are doing some good things through education other than you and I?
Boy, oh boy, talk about tooting your own horn.
No,
we are.
That's what
Here
we do.
are.
I'm a proud Christian.
There you go. So we're going to talk about a couple of nonprofit groups here. Let's speak first of all of the Oaks Academy. If you go on the oaksacademy.org, you can check them out. They've got a great school downtown Indianapolis doing great work. It's a classical school, so if you're at all interested in the trivium method, check those folks out. We've got the Master's Study, which has a couple of different campuses, actually, not only in the midsection of the city, but also on the west side of the city. The mastersstudy.org. Check them out. They're a homeschool group. It's not the same as other homeschool groups, but they have all different kinds of folks there. and they're doing wonderful work. And I actually have the privilege of teaching a course there in the fall called Gothic Horror Literature. So if you're interested in checking some of that stuff out, I'll be happy to chat with you. You go online, you can find all kinds of things about homeschool resources. There are fantastic things going on. One of the big issues I would say right now for churches, and I would highly encourage churches to think about this and expand their present ministries into daycare. What a wonderful opportunity there would be to have these little ones. Their parents have to go to work. You've got a Christian ministry. You have a daycare option. Make that available to young parents who are struggling in that way. Neighbors, I got to tell you, neighbor to neighbor kind of stuff, it works because it's, again, person to person. But I'm going to come back full around to the same thing we talked about in the last segment, and that is every single stay-at-home parent is the person who is doing good in education in Indianapolis because they are there spending time with their kids. That's what it's all about.
No substitute for it. None.
Yep.
And we mentioned earlier in the program about the culture.
Yep.
And we talk about this all the time.
All the time.
You know, just the differences in cultures. And we talked about blanket education.
Right.
So,
Yeah.
you know, how can we, you know, or is there a difference, I guess, you know, between how the culture educates and then how Christians should educate their children?
Yes. So let's come back to your good phrase there, the blanket education, because I want to hit that first. That thing just is wrong. For all of the years of my educational life, 30-plus years as a teacher, from 7th grade through PhD students, I hate it when I hear teachers say, well, I'm going to cover the material. You don't cover material. That's your blanket education approach, man. We don't do that kind of thing. We're interested in the individual student as best we can possibly meet their needs. We segue what we're teaching, the content, into their lives in a way that just allows them to blossom. I've told stories on this program before about some of my students who, at the end of the day, has changed my view of how I define education. Education for me is when my students don't need me anymore. I've given them the tools that they need to think through life and how to deal with life, and then they go and live it. Let me give you some examples of this, the difference, though, between culture and Christians. I was sitting at a bookstore looking through some business books. And I realized these business books were plagiarizing Solomon and giving him no credit, because all these business books were talking about these universal principles that were coming right out of Proverbs. I was sitting in IUPUI classes this semester. Folks want to talk about why intolerance is wrong, or why misogyny is wrong against women, or why child abuse is wrong, but they assume their ethics. They only want to talk about these things being wrong, but they have no transcendent source for these ideas. They have no basis for the ethics. Biblical truth, what did we say in the first time? Has no expiration date, man. Here's the answer to the question. If we acknowledge an outside source of truth, there should be no difference. So it doesn't matter as long as you're acknowledging this outside source of truth. All creation is sustained by God. If we apply the right way of thinking, the mindset shift to questions, then problems will have solutions and directions will be obvious. Man, I'll tell you what, I get excited and charged here.
Well, you know, sometimes certain notes just hit strike a chord, and God's word has no expiration date.
That's right.
You know, when you go back to the Bible and you read it and reread it, and it's always the same principle, but then you can get so many different, depending on your maturity level.
Mm-hmm.
Where are you now versus where are you 2 years from now? And when you read, the principle will be the same.
That's right.
But the way you manifest it in the life that you're living at that time will be different.
Yeah.
It's amazing.
Yeah.
So I just had to smile because it doesn't have an expiration date. Tell us some stories about being a parent and an educator and a Christian.
That's
a tough deal. That's the trifecta.
I had a big sign in my window in one of my rooms that I taught in that said, "Christianity is not for wimps." Being a Christian is difficult because there are responsibilities to be distinctive from our culture, and our culture has such an influence on everybody, including us, that we have to constantly push back against the culture. So here's some examples. I came home from school. This is way back in the day when I was teaching in Bismarck, North Dakota. I came home after school one day. My son was watching Sesame Street. I sat down next to him, watched for a bit. I said, "What did you learn about God today on Sesame Street?" He says, "I don't know. They didn't talk about him." At that point, this light shined on me, and I remember thinking to myself, my responsibility as a parent is to critique the culture. Even at 3 years old, my kids watching Sesame Street. My son and I would listen to his music. I would sit and listen to his music, whatever it was that he was interested in, talk about his interests, be involved in his pursuits. I was his coach for 3 years on a baseball team, all that kind of stuff. Remember what we said about Proverbs 22:6. It's how he is bent, the direction that he goes. My view of being a father was that I maintained the responsibility of teaching my own kids, so I wrote a catechism for them that they memorize. And these are the kinds of things that they remember. My daughter, for my birthday this last week, she wrote this on Facebook. I went back and found it and wrote this down to remind myself this morning. She wrote this to me for my birthday. To the man who taught me to fear the Lord and follow Jesus. It's kind of hard to read this.
Go ahead, man. I understand.
It's a hard thing sometimes. She says, to the man who taught me to fear the Lord and follow Jesus, that ideas and words are important, and that loving others is the best way to live out our faith. Happy birthday. So there it is. My daughter, my son's emailing me this morning about different issues and ideas. To be a parent, to be a dad, means that you're there. Students from the beginning of all of the times that I taught, from my birthday this last weekend, they wrote this kind of stuff. I would tell them all the time, I don't want you to believe anything I tell you. I want you to be Bereans. I don't know how many times this last week I got that back at me. It was wonderful. I got Taylor Sorensen down in Nashville, Tennessee, who I used to say in class, I said, man, I'm teaching this stuff, but there's a song in there somewhere. He's cutting his 4th LP down in Nashville now. Erica Rice, this homeschooling mom, got 5 kids at home, just messaging with her this AM about how important teaching was in raising her 5 kids and how they beg her kids begging her to go to the movies with them so they can discuss what they see with their mom. Who does that? Who does that? But
Students
kids.
of Dr. Mark Eckel.
That's so wonderful. So there it is, some stories about kids and my kids.
Well, as we go to the break, here's Proverbs. Desire to accomplish is sweet to the soul, and I'm sure
there it
after
is.
Reading some of those passages from your students, your children, you have to be proud. So we're going to come back. We're going to find out what's going on in the world of Miss Camille Cantwell on the Warp and Woof Radio Show. You are listening to Cool Groove Radio. RadioNext.tv, and we're back. Warp and Woof Radio on the Cool Groove site. Dr. Mark Eckel.
Yes, sir.
Did some teaching in the first hour, man. As I always say, instruction in the first hour and conversation in the second hour. And we want to welcome to RadioNext.tv Miss Camille Cantwell, and it's your show, big boss.
All right, man. We're going to go. We just want to remind everybody about parenting and education and why this is so important. It really is a shift of mindset. We have to think differently than the world teaches us to think. This isn't about us. It's about our kids. That's huge. So, Camille, welcome to the show. We're really happy that you're here. Let's start off by telling us a little bit about yourself.
All right. Well, I've lived a long life, so this may take a while.
Okay.
I was born and raised as the youngest of 13 children in Hartford, Wisconsin. So I'm from Wisconsin. I lived and grew up in Wisconsin. I graduated from the University of Wisconsin in Whitewater with a degree in journalism and political science, so I have a double major.
Nice.
After I finished college, I got my first job in politics, working for the Assembly Republican Caucus staff up in Madison, Wisconsin.
Yep.
First time I went to Madison was when I went for my job interview, and I worked for them for 5.5 years. I then, after working there, had an opportunity to work with Tommy Thompson, who happened to be the minority floor leader at the time. He ran for governor, and I worked with his campaign, and then also worked on campaigns for in my off season, I guess, from working with the Assembly Republican Caucus. I worked for the Republican Party a little bit. And anyhow, Tommy Thompson got elected as governor, so he brought me on his staff, and I worked for him for 2.5 years.
That's great.
After 2.5 years, I worked, well, first before I get into where I went, after that I worked with welfare reform. I worked on social issues such as pro-life issues. I worked on an anti-obscenity law. I worked closely with Concerned Women for America and some of the work they did, and was involved with them. I also did a little bit on home education, not a lot. It pretty much was over by the time I was in the governor's office, and we left it alone. My interest was mostly in the area of welfare reform.
Okay.
So then, when I turned around 31 years old, I decided, I'd had enough of politics. My goal in politics was always, I would like government to be so small that they would eliminate my need for my job, and I would be taken out of a job. Well, that never happened, and so I had to leave on my own. So at 31, I decided to go back to school, and I went to law school. And I moved to Virginia Beach, Virginia, where I attended Regent University School of Law.
Good place.
Which, if you are familiar with CBN, it's connected with Christian Broadcasting Network. So I went there, and after law school, I came to Indiana because I had a job opportunity to work with an attorney here actually in Carmel, Indiana. So I took my bar exam and passed it, and in 1992 I became a licensed attorney in Indiana.
And that's Juris Doctorate, folks. You listen to a doctor here. This is important.
Well, I don't know about that. So my first job was working with nonprofit law. I had actually worked in law school with a professor and helped him. He was writing a book to teach nonprofit law, so I was his research assistant, had done a lot of research on nonprofit law, so it was sort of like God had directed me to do that and then brought me into a position where I could use that knowledge to work with churches and nonprofit organizations. After that, and I was self-employed basically during that time. After that, I left there and decided to go still in a nonprofit sort of Christian atmosphere and work for a charitable trust company that administered charitable trusts and in Carmel. And so I did that for over 5 years.
Wow. You have had a multifaceted career.
Yes,
here.
I have.
My word.
So during that time, though, I was not married until I came to Indiana.
Okay.
And then I met my husband, David, at church, which was a great place to meet him. And we've been married for 22 years.
Nice.
I have 2 children, 2 sons. One is in college, and one is almost ready to graduate from high school next year, hopefully. And so that's pretty much, where I came from and what my background is.
No, that's really great. And actually, Nathaniel will be on this next week. And Nathaniel, if you're listening this morning, you got to bring it like your mom's bringing it here this morning, man. There's no pressure or anything.
No pressure.
No pressure. But so tell us now about some of the things. Let's go back, okay? If we could go back and say, okay, what were some of the ways that your Christian beliefs have formed your views of law, education, and parenting? If you could kind of highlight some of that. I mean, you've had such a varied life experience. How would you say that this has transpired for you?
Well, I was single for 36 years. I got married at the age of 36.
Okay.
And so my life before that was pretty much based upon me and growing in my career and learning law and being involved in politics. And then when I got married, I continued to work, but I had children, and things changed.
Yes.
I was fortunate to have a husband who allowed me to stay home and live at home without a job, even though I had a pretty good career and probably could have made a lot of money doing what I did. But he thought, and we thought together, that it was more important to raise our children. And he worked hard so that I could stay home and be a stay-at-home mom. So it changed my perspective, I think, a little bit. Before we even had children, we both decided at that point we would like to home educate, educate our children at home. So we did do a lot of study and learning a little bit about it, and went to conventions and it would just seem like a natural thing. And I think it really helped to be kind of an older mom, too, because I had no desire to be in that workforce and that mode of thinking. I had done that.
Yes.
I was happy doing it, but now this was a shift that God had brought in my life.
Right.
So how I got involved in the education realm was because I home educated my children. And I always say I educated my children from the time they were born until my responsibility is until they graduate from high school. And I did that with my first son and my second son as well. So
That's great.
That's kind of how I got involved in the education realm. It's not because I have any expertise in education particularly.
Understood. But you had the experience of having two sons. So I said something, you heard what I had to say about Proverbs 22:6, the way your children are bent. Do you see that in your children, that they're different from each other, and how would you express how that is fulfilled in a proverbial sense?
Well, actually, my Christian beliefs in that whole, how did I view parenting, I actually went back to Deuteronomy 6, where, God said that when you are with your children in the gates and at home, and when they rise up and when they go to bed, you are to teach them His ways and His commandments. And so that was sort of like, okay, that makes sense. If they're at school, I'm not really, teaching them. I'm not able to do that. But I still think it was really important to be with my children. And having raised them as toddlers, I saw that when I had those teachable moments, when my oldest son was ready to learn something, I would sit down and teach him. So, yes, Proverbs, then we get to the Proverbs where they were bent in a certain way, and I began to realize, teaching kids, especially when you have two, you see how different they are and how they learn differently. Right. And that sort of surprised me. I guess I shouldn't have thought that, being the youngest of 13 children. We're all different. But it helped me to understand that children learn differently and at different speeds. My first son was very quick at learning, for example, oral communication skills. He was talking at the age of 1 and saying words. He learned his alphabet and learned his colors and his numbers, and he did things at a very early age. My second son didn't really say a whole lot until he was 2. He liked his brother speaking for him. So his oral communication skills weren't as early on. Not to say that he didn't develop them later, but it was just the progression was different. So, yes, you had to adapt to how they learned and what they were interested in. One was much more active than the other. I'm not going to tell you which one, but one was more active than the other. One day I looked out on my second-story window, and one of my sons is on the top of the tree, and he's only about 2 years old, and I'm thinking, oh my goodness. So yes, one was more of a daredevil than the other. But you have to adapt how you teach to your children.
When you think about this, the life goals kinds of things, I mean, you're at a certain stage of life. You told me actually when we met that you've had 2 lives, but now you're really onto your 3rd life. I mean, in a sense that you're progressing into other areas. Tell us about this food thing you got going on.
Wow, that's a...
Yeah, just come on.
All right. Well, I do have a food blog because I like to cook.
Good. Tell them about it.
My food blog?
Yeah, tell them. What is it?
It is called Meals by Camille, and it's on Blogspot. So Meals by Camille, spelled M-E-A-L, C-A-M-A-M-E-A-L. But anyhow, it's just, I log things and I take pictures, and I like to cook, and I like to preserve it for my children because they enjoy eating my food. So I figured when I'm gone, that's my legacy.
Beautiful stuff. Yep. Okay, we're going to take a short break and come back. Camille Cantwell in the house, and go to Meals by Camille on the blog. I know I am, because we do a lot of cooking and food up at RadioNext.tv. So if you have some meals that you want to discuss, give us a shout. RadioNext.tv on the cool. RadioNext.tv, on the Cool Groove site, Warp and Woof Radio. Dr. Mark Eckel and Camille Cantwell in the house today. Special guest, and a very, very intriguing life you live, young lady. I'm serious. You've done it. You've done a bunch.
Yes, she has.
Yes.
Well, let's talk about some of these ideas here that kind of brought you from point A to point B. Tell us about how you became invested in law and its relationship to education.
Well, I have a legal background, and I have a background in reading and helping form legislation. And one day, a statewide organization that advocates for home education here in Indiana came to me, just letting me know of an opportunity. It was actually somebody I worked with who worked with the organization and said, "Hey, are you interested in doing some work with this homeschool group? And if you are, get in contact with this person." So I thought, well, my kids are growing up and I don't need to be with them all the time. So this might be a good way for me to, just use what God has given me, my education. And since I was a stay-at-home mom, my license is still on inactive status, which means I can't practice law. And I thought, well, what better way to use it than to volunteer and help? So having a background in home education, having a background in law, having a background in reading legislation, it seemed to be a good fit. They needed somebody who had that sort of background, and so I volunteered to help this organization just be a better, more, I guess, give them a different insight. They were all homeschool moms themselves, so none of them really had that expertise. And I thought, okay, Lord, you've opened the store. Why not walk through it?
Absolutely. It always fascinates me that people's backgrounds make a huge difference in the directions that they go and how you're led to certain things. And so your first, as you suggested earlier, your first 36 years were about you, but nonetheless you were being prepared for the things that you would spend really the rest of this life now, the second part of your life doing, which is helping so many other people. Which then leads us to the question, why are parental rights so important in education, especially to homeschoolers?
I think that's a great question to ask, because I think you really need a history lesson. And having some background in law, I thought, I'm going to look this up because I really need to know this. I knew it, but I didn't know it as well. So I looked this up, and HSLDA, which is the Homeschool Legal Defense Association, they are out in Washington, D.C. They look out for federal things. There was an article about this very thing on their website. And so I took a look at it, and the person who wrote this, I'm going to be sort of taking a little bit about what he wrote.
Sure.
But it started basically in 1923 with a Supreme Court case called Meyer versus Nebraska, in which it recognized that parents had the right to direct the religious upbringing of their children and to control the process of their education. 2 years later, there was a very important case called Pierce versus Society of Sisters that supported that. And it basically struck down an Oregon compulsory education law, which required attendance of all children between 8 and 16 to attend only public schools. Now, if you look back at the history of our country, home education was something we did. In the 1800s, people educated their children at home. Then there came a movement of compulsory education laws, which was evidenced in the early 1900s, in which everyone was required to send their children to school. Now, did everybody send their children? Probably they weren't successful. And it probably wasn't a bad idea because people weren't educating their children the way, to read, and the literacy rate wasn't as good as it was. But the fact that they required it of all public schools took away parental freedom to choose. So, but this particular, the Pierce case, asserted that children are not mere creatures of the state, that parents have a right to instruct their children clearly. That takes precedence over the state's regulatory interest, unless, of course, there's a public safety issue.
Okay.
So if children are endangered, then, of course, the state has the right to come in and help and protect those children. But the state has no more right over your children than you do. And that's the movement. It was going in that direction. So 21 years later, there was another case called the Griswold case, and that emphasized that the state can't interfere with the right of a parent to control his children's education. And then 48 years after the Pierce decision, the Supreme Court again held up the Pierce Charter that the rights of parents to direct the upbringing of the children was a fundamental right. And that was the Wisconsin versus Yoder case, which I was familiar with because I'm from Wisconsin, but also because it was something that I studied in law school.
Sure.
And that said that there's a fundamental interest of parents, as contrasted with the state, to guide the religious future and education of their children. It said the history and culture of the Western civilization reflect a strong tradition of parental concern for the nurture and upbringing of their children. So this case was an Amish case in which the children did not have to go to school beyond 8th grade, and they were trying to have a compulsory education law which would require them to continue, and they fought against it and won. So as a result, we pretty much have a constitutional right as parents to direct the upbringing of our children and their education, and that can be anywhere from sending them to public school, to private school, to tutoring, to home education. And that's clearly the direction we're going in now with the school choice. But I think the bigger issue is because it is a fundamental right, there's a balancing act, which is, we hear this often called the compelling state interest test. And that's where the state must prove that in order to infringe upon the parental rights to educate and direct their children's education, the state has to have a compelling state interest, and it must be in the least restrictive way to fulfill that state interest.
There you go.
So if you're going to compel parents to educate their children, which we have compulsory education laws, that it must be in the least restrictive way. And that's where we are today. In Indiana, we have very, very little restrictions on homeschool education because, again, the burden is pretty great on the state to prove that they aren't educating their children. So if there's that reason, then you have a reason to come in. For example, if you're educationally neglecting your children, then the state has a reason to come in and make sure those children are educated. But a homeschooler who takes their responsibilities seriously will be educating their children. And I contend that anyone who's serious about educating their children and take the time, because it's like private tutoring for the most part, that they will actually exceed the expectations of the state.
Every single time, absolutely. Could you tell us again about that group in D.C. that you got this information from, just so I could hear it again?
Sure. It's called HSLDA, Homeschool Legal Defense Association.
Okay. And that's a .org or a .com?
I believe it's a .org, yes.
Okay.
And they actually have lawyers. They have staff attorneys that they hire, and they help to protect. You can join. It does cost money to join. As a homeschooler, you can join the organization, but then you have protection if you should ever have the state come after you.
But you actually found this information that you were telling us about on their website.
I did.
Which is really good. I mean, anybody who's interested in this topic of homeschooling, education, law, I mean, the history behind this is so obvious to anybody, and we just need to do our homework, obviously, as Camille has already done. So tell us about your current position in the homeschool movement and what you do.
Okay. Well, as I said, I had this opportunity presented to me. It's really what you said, Mark. It's a complete understanding that God directs our paths. We don't, we have certain choices, but if the Lord wants us to move in a certain way, He will direct our paths, and we have to trust Him. And my life verse is the just shall live by faith. So God, brings me opportunities. I'm going to jump in and have the faith to believe God's directing my paths. So what happened 3 years ago is the Indiana Association of Home Educators asked if I would join their legislative team, which is now called their government affairs team. And I agreed to do that. And during legislative session, which in Indiana is very short, we have a short session and a long session. And believe it or not, the long session it only goes till April, and the short session only goes till March. I came from Wisconsin, which had a full-time legislature, so it was all the time. So I was totally unprepared for what was to come. And they move so quickly, bills move very fast, and so we have to read them, analyze them, see if there's an issue that would affect home education or parental rights. And we have bill readers that do that, and then they're filtered to me, and I look at them. If there's any question, does it affect homeschooling? Does it not? Is there something we can do? This recent last legislative session, which ended in March of this year, there was actually a chance for us to do some proactive work, which was to ask the legislature to actually put in some statutory language to tweak a statute that's currently on the books regarding children who take classes from public schools. The state, the Department of Education had issued an edict saying that all home-educated students who took any class, one class in the public school, would have to take the I-steps, and we did not believe that was a correct reading, nor did we think that was correct, because I-steps measure the curriculum and the teaching in the public school, and if you have a student taking a band class or a gym class, how are you actually evaluating the teachers and the curriculum of that public school? So we asked the legislature to put a provision in that said they can ask, but it's not required. And so as a result, we were able to get that passed through legislation. Right. And there were some other things that we were able to do, a scholarship opportunity, which originally started with you had to have an accredited homeschools are private schools, but they aren't accredited. So an accredited diploma from a high school to be able to even apply for the scholarship. We asked, hey, why does it have to be accredited? If homeschoolers issue a diploma, they're certifying they have the same education as those in the public and private schools. And so they dropped the accredited, and now that opens the door for that scholarship to be available to homeschoolers as well.
That's great. It sure sounds like the emphasis that you've had, again, throughout your life. Now you are able to share this with other people, and the expertise that you bring to the table is really second to none. I mean, this is wonderful stuff that you're doing here.
Well, I can just say one thing, and that is attorneys generally don't volunteer for this because they can make a lot more money.
Of course.
And if that's your motivation, you probably wouldn't do it.
I'm just intrigued about the homeschooling process itself. What I found is I was somewhere in between a public school and a homeschool. We were funded by Nina Mason Pulliam and the Lilly Endowment to educate people who had been expelled or suspended for semesters at a time from a public school setting. And I noticed that the discipline I was able to display, not ratchet discipline, but just firm disciplinarian type tactics, help my young people come along. Do you think the major benefit in homeschooling, I know it's the care of the child from the parent a lot, but talk about discipline in public schools and how it just distracts from the educational process of a lot of the kids in the classroom. I found that to be the most powerful tool that I had was a small group that I could administer discipline to if I needed to in a constructive way.
Right.
Not in a I'm kicking you out of school, but
right.
in like a parenting type of way.
Yes.
Do you notice that?
Actually, there's a group, and I'm sorry, I don't remember the name of the organization, but it's a gentleman who does run a school for that very reason, for kids who are like, this is their last-ditch effort. And I've heard that actually several ways, that the problem in the public schools is they're not administered discipline immediately. And they're not disciplined in a way that's positive. It's a negative discipline.
It's
right.
Get out.
Right, exactly. You're expelled if you don't follow our rules, rather than training that child in the
Here's how you need to act in a social setting.
Right.
So let's practice this.
And it's administered immediately. So if somebody's out of line and you're with 4 or 5 people around a table, it's administered immediately, and they know right then that that's the wrong behavior, and it's not that we're going to, kick you out of here. It's, hey, how could you do this better?
Yeah.
What's a more positive way to say this? Bullying, for example, is it's a horrible problem in the public schools. And the reason why it is nobody ever shames them. I mean, they're just allowed to do it, and it's not ever told, hey, that's not the way you treat people. Mm-hmm. And so I think the smaller setting. But in homeschool, you have the benefit of a parent who also is looking out for their, not everybody homeschools because they're Christian, but they have a vested interest in that. And while I agree with you, Mark, that we aren't responsible for the outcome, that's up to God. I've homeschooled both my children. The outcomes are not identical. We don't have identical outcomes in our homeschooling experience. But the fact of the matter is you give them the opportunity to do those things. And hopefully as parents, we're able to at least look at it, make the little corrections, call them out on it. We're not being mean about it because we love our children. And that's often what happens. And I'm not saying public school teachers don't love their kids.
Oh,
don't get me wrong. I think public school teachers do an amazing job.
Absolutely.
But it's you can't. Everybody's not the same.
Yeah.
Everyone. The standardization of education has not been successful.
No, it has not. We find this to be true all the time. I'm going back to HB's comment about blanket education. It just does not. It's not a helpful tool. So that kind of leads us to this next issue about your view of government's role in education. You've kind of danced around it a little bit.
Yes.
But kind of target this a little bit now.
Actually, education there is a role. I looked up the Indiana State Constitution, which I believe was passed in 1857 or 1858, somewhere in there. Even though we became a state in 1816, the Constitution we live under now was formed in the 1850s. Article 8, there's a section called Education, and Section 1 says the common school system. And I'm just going to read this real quickly.
Sure, go ahead.
It says, knowledge and learning generally diffused throughout a community being essential to the preservation of a free government, it should be the duty of the General Assembly to encourage, by all suitable means, moral, intellectual, scientific, and cultural and agricultural improvement, and provide by law for a general and uniform system of common schools wherein tuition shall, without charge, and equally open to all. So basically, the Constitution sets up a provision for a common school or free public education. Now, in that, it doesn't say it's a compulsory thing. Right. That's actually state statutes. But the role of government is to, and I love this, for the preservation of a free government.
Free government, there you go.
So if you want to be free, you have to be educated. If you can't read, if you can't write, if you can't, do the basics of what it requires a citizen to do, then you are a subject of the state. Yep. You are at the mercy of somebody else telling you and teaching you how, what's going on. That's why history is so important. We need to know the history, and we need to read original documents, not somebody's version of history. So to me, the role of education and the public education system is an important role. We need to, but it's also that it's by all suitable means. That doesn't mean the state alone can do that. It could be private education, it can be public education, it can be home education. So the duty of the state is to make sure people are educated, that they are able to function, and that we maintain a free government and a free society. The role of I thought, okay, so I look it up in the Indiana State Constitution because I know education is a state responsibility. So I go to the U.S. Constitution, and I look, and there's nothing about education. Mm-hmm. And I'm thinking to myself, okay, we have already abrogated our responsibility to the federal government. Now the federal government is taking over the education system. But that was never the intention of the federal government. So the role of government is not the role of the federal government. The federal government has a very limited role. I mean, we talk about that all the time. But now that we're giving more and more of that responsibility to the federal government, we're seeing more and more standardization, right? Common Core, all this stuff. And so what has happened? We've actually diluted the whole purpose of what I think the government's role is, which is let's make sure they're educated, but let's make sure that they have the freedom to choose which education they have. And so there's a lot of pushback. The biggest problem I see is that the federal government now gives money to the states. It's all tied in, and the states have been lured by that money. That's right. And so they're dependent on it. And now to break free from that, they would have to give up millions of dollars. And who, in their right mind, who's a politician, is going to give up millions of dollars to say, I don't want your money anymore, federal government? But that's what's necessary to actually get back to the concept that the best government or the best education is the education that comes closest to you, the individual. So the common school system, where you have school districts who are accountable to the parents and tax the people so you don't get ridiculous tax bills for education. But at the same time, parents can decide how much do they want, how much do they don't want. But we have diluted that in a lot of ways. And so government has a role. There's no question. Government has a role to protect children when their life is in danger, when there's endangering, situations. There's no question. But I don't think government's role is at the federal level, and I don't believe that it's compulsory that everybody go to public school.
Man, this is some good stuff, man. This is, yeah, absolutely. Go right ahead.
Wow, we'll be right back. Warp and Woof Radio. We are learning something this morning on the Warp and Woof Radio show on Cool. RadioNext.tv on the Cool Group site. You are listening to Warp and Woof Radio. Dr. Mark Eckel, our special guest, Camille Cantwell, and you have been given some powerful information, and my people on my Facebook page is loving it. So we thank you for gracing RadioNext.tv today.
Yeah, it's been great. So we just have a few minutes left. Let's get to the last couple questions. You told me in our chat together about lifetime learning being a passion. Tell us about that.
Well, it's a passion because it works. I have always felt that the most important role, and I think it's funny you said this earlier, education is when my students don't need me anymore.
There you go.
And you said that, Mark, and it resonates with me. Education is only a means to lifetime learning. And lifetime learning is one of those things that doesn't matter how old you are. Even if you're 80, 90 years old, you can learn something new. And I think you, HB, you were talking about helping, the senior citizens learn technology. Those are all lifetime learning skills. And I'm so passionate about it because if we have this idea that education only happens between kindergarten and 12th grade and maybe college, then we're done learning, then we've lost the whole point of what education is about. Education's about teaching people how to learn, and then once they learn how to learn, they can learn anything they want to learn. And my children are a testimony of that truth.
So this idea that we don't teach people what to think, we teach them how to think is so powerful and important.
I think how to think and how to be able to discern what's truth and what's not. Okay. As Christians, we measure truth based upon what the Bible says, but we can also look at, if there's a website that's constantly saying things that seem a little out of whack, we ought to not just say, okay, that's true because, I saw it on the internet. You actually have to investigate. Sure. And it's powerful, but it's also work. Yes. It's not something that you stop doing. And I think all of life requires you to be diligent and learn how to discern good and evil, how to discern right and wrong. Those are all things we learn through our entire life. And if I ever stop learning, then, somebody shoot me because that's not my life. I don't want to be that way.
So let's connect that back to something you said before the break, and that was the issue of protecting freedom and the preservation connection. So tie those two things together, the need for lifelong learning and every generation's responsibility.
Well, as President Reagan said, is that freedom is not something we inherit. Every generation is responsible to preserve and make sure we are free. So as we continue to teach our children lifetime learning, they also have to learn what it was that made them free. Mm-hmm. Are they free with when government tells them how to think and what to do?
Right.
No, they're not.
Right.
They're free when they take personal responsibility for their own lives. Mm-hmm. We used to teach something called self-government in our schools. Mm-hmm. I don't know that they still teach. I don't even know if people know what self-government is. But it's the smallest government, and it's the government we're most able to administer ourselves. When we have self-government, self-discipline, then the rest of the government system can fall into place. But the problem is people don't have self-government. They don't know how to govern themselves. They don't know how to be sacrificial in what they do. It's the me, and they have lost the idea that you sacrifice, you work hard, you do things to accomplish and achieve goals. So I think that part of the freedom comes with knowing that you have a responsibility, and that responsibility is a personal responsibility.
So if you don't have self-restraint, then the government is going to restrain you.
Absolutely. Someone's going to restrain you. And if the government doesn't, if the state government or the local government doesn't do it, then the federal government. And the problem is we have too much federal government trying to tell us.
And since we're doing Proverbs, Dr. Eckel, isn't that scripture in Proverbs about being led like sheep?
That's right. Exactly
If
right.
we don't take advantage and control ourselves and regulate ourselves, then
That's right.
we will be led like sheep.
Yeah, we talk about this all the time, the necessity of the internal compulsion that we have that's necessary to create freedom outside of ourselves, but there has to be a restraint within too. That's so huge.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So you had you wanted to make sure to have a few words here at the end for our audience. I always ask people, what are your final words that you want to leave with an audience? So tell us what those might be.
Well, first of all, I think life is short. I have 18 years basically with my children. And that's a very short time. It seems like a long time when you first have your children, but it's a very short time. And I believe we should not waste that time with our children. It is a time when God gives us the opportunity to teach our children, to nurture our children, to shape our children, not to indoctrinate them, but to show them the way in which they should go. And I believe that if there's anything that we should do, we should not waste that time. Homeschooling is not for everyone. But if God calls you to homeschooling, you better be obedient and do it.
There you go. Wise words, man. I don't know. I kind of feel like
you like Ted Williams up in here, man. You ended out. You batting a historic batting record for these shows, Mark Eckel.
Oh, thanks, man. I appreciate it. It was great to have you, Camille. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
All right, and we'll see you next Wednesday, 10 a.m. to 12 o'clock p.m. Eastern Standard Time on the Cool Groove site. Don't forget to stay tuned. If you thought this was powerful, we've got some more men with words of wisdom. The preachers are coming in. Reverend Charles Harris and Reverend Charles Ellis, James W. Jackson are coming in, and they are going to present the community voice. And we thank you again for tuning in to the Warp and Woof Radio Show. Dr. Mark Eckel, you are always a pleasure, my brother.
Thank you.